So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Marie Wilson.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I want to acknowledge the work that the Community Foundations of Canada have done in their fellowship and association, as well as through the Circle of Philanthropy that formed and has taken particular efforts in the broad interpretation of reconciliation and supporting such initiatives. I want, because it's the first time I've had a chance to say a few opening words myself, to appreciate and add my acknowledgement to the Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis of this part of Saskatchewan. And I also want to acknowledge the drum and the beautiful songs of prayer and the honor songs that we've had throughout the day, and how uplifting that has been. We say back home, Newe Sine Masi, to give thanks also to Creator for the gift of this day and the grace that has brought us all safely to it. You know, I heard the word just in the introduction, what a tumultuous day, and what was the other word? Anyway, it implied a lot of turbulent back and forthing, and so has been the schedule for today, as it has to do with me. Because at one point I was closing the day, and then I was at one point opening the day, and then I was going to do a panel first and then have a keynote address, and then it was going to be the other way around. And in that spirit, I thought I better actually write some stuff down. Otherwise, whatever panel I end up being on, I'll end up saying the very same thing as I would have said in my speech. And what if I have to say those things before my speech? So, so I did write some things down, and I have not had the benefit of being with you all of yesterday and today, but I can see from your rich program, I know from the experience of previous Wicihitowin conferences, which I've had the honor of attending, and from the buzz in the room, that it has been really uplifting for all of you. So rather than trying to specifically place myself in that, I thought what I could perhaps best do in closing out this gathering and coming into it late is share with you some of the reflections that I have on the broad themes of our work and our days and years since the close of our official work, but also to share with you, as became my habit, the things that I brought from the last place I was. That's one of the ways I tried to keep survivors connected to each other as we did our work, is to tell this gathering what the survivors at the last gathering had shared as a way of helping people remember that they were not alone and that they were connected. So in short, I'm going to be doing more reading than I normally do, and I hope you'll indulge me with that for all those reasons that I've just explained to you. And as was said in the introduction this morning, I come from a long career in journalism. So I pay attention to the news probably as much or perhaps more than some people. And I have to say, as you already know, that the news of the day is so full of our collective disappointments, isn't it? But instead, what I want to do is reflect back to each other and to all of us some of the positives, the encouragement, the hopeful, and the uplifting. Those are the kinds of reflections I want to share with you, more in the spirit of what I also tried to offer in my role as one of your TRC commissioners. And perhaps some of you will remember that at the end of each day's hearings, that's what I used to do, to feed back to those gathered the key points of what I had heard that day. But rather than repeating the details of all the devastation, I made my efforts to try to capture and offer back the positives of the day. I was trying intentionally to hold a loving mirror up to those in the room, many often too blinded by their own heartaches and losses to see or recognize the strength, beauty, and resilience, and sometimes even the poetry in their own words and in their own actions, both during their years as children in the residential school and in their lifetime since then. I still believe that we need to be that honest and loving mirror to each other, despite our frustrations, not as a reason for pretending that things are any better than they are, not at all, but rather to provide each other with the encouragement and inspiration and hope that we surely need as we continue to face the obstacles and outrages before us, so that we can continue to believe that things can still become so much better than they are. Over the past 3 years since we finished our official work, I've been asked many times to reflect back on the lessons learned from our TRC. And often, especially in other countries, what people want to know about is the inner workings of the Commission, how we did what we did and how we came to our conclusions. And I've both spoken and written about these things. But for the sake of anyone in this room who may not still know or remember, I am just going to take a minute or two to highlight some of the key things that were very particular about our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The first was that it was not a government commission. That's what we think of when we think commission. We think government. This one was independent. It was created by a court-imposed process, a conclusion, and it was led by the victims of harm. It was led by Indigenous people. The government and the churches were ordered to do certain things, including to participate in and to support the TRC. Our job had nothing to do with monies, but rather to gather and distribute history and knowledge and understanding to all the people of Canada. Our job was to inspire through infinite acts of ongoing reconciliation. This gathering being one of those, a better reality and future for Indigenous peoples within Canada. And guess what we were all supposed to do? The governments, the churches, and the people of Canada, to respond in the spirit of reconciliation, in the spirit of reconciliation. So we were in over 300 communities altogether. You've heard about the national events, but those were 7. We were in over 300 communities, and we held hearings in 77 of those. We gathered almost 7,000 statements. You hear a lot about the 94 calls to action, but just as important and perhaps keys to your next steps are the principles of reconciliation that we articulated about how to do those things, in what company, and with what new relationships. We established the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which Rai Moran is leading, and you've heard from Rai the importance of that as a sacred repository and safeguarding of all that was shared with us in good faith. And since that time, each commissioner unofficially has been advancing the work and sharing our experiences. In my case, as I mentioned earlier today, throughout Canada and internationally. I have to tell you that in some ways it has been a very long and lonely road since the commission wrapped up in December 2015. And I have to admit, I am very sad about one aspect of today. I truly was looking forward to seeing Wilton Littlechild and Murray Sinclair, as it would have been the first time we had gathered together since that last formal presentation in December, almost 3 years ago. I say that not out of a sense of nostalgia, but because it's an important reminder to me, and I hope to all, about the importance of our being together, of deciding to stay together, not to fall apart. The community that we created, our little trio of 3, we definitely did not always agree. In fact, sometimes we had heated discussions, but we did listen to each other. We definitely challenged each other, and we learned from each other, knowing that we did not come from the same places or experiences, whether from the point of view of family or culture or personality or personal life story or profession. And so in that sense, we were kind of a microcosm of the diversity that we are now asking ourselves to bring together and to find a way to work together. And we did hold each other together and lift each other up, understanding that together we were a stronger whole than any one of us as individuals. We were a threesome, but we became a community, like family. Over the past few weeks, I've had several reminders about community and connection. I recently had the great, I'll say privilege, it always is a privilege and honor, of spending time with some elders that I had not met before, and it was the context of a North American gathering related to drug and alcohol addictions. And one of the elders there expressed an idea that I knew, but in words I had not heard described before. And I want to share that with you. And it was to her point that we can't just wait for some government program or for some institutional change. There are things that we need to take care of ourselves. She said, our traditional knowledge is like a complete encyclopedia of everyone's gifts and our way of being. Our children were the way we preserved that knowledge as we passed it on from one generation to the next. Every time a child was removed from our community or our family, it was like a page of that encyclopedia was torn away. A missing piece of our know-how on how to live together in community. Today, she said, everyone is trying to grab back the missing pieces, borrowing bits of it from our relatives here and there, trying to piece ourselves back together again. Her words seemed so powerful to me. It was a new way of thinking about all the devastation that we witnessed in communities throughout the country during our TRC hearings and that still exist in so many places. As we heard about the impacts of the children being taken away to residential school, the impacts on them, but also, as we heard earlier today, the impacts on the parents, the families, and the communities left behind. And it reminded me also of the words of one of our other TRC honorary witnesses. Some of you may know of her, Jane Middleton Moss, highly published, and she's been a pioneering counselor in the field of addictions recovery and childhood traumas. And as she says, when it comes to healing and reconciliation, and as she said when she bore witness to our TRC process, connection is the correction. The evening before the elder I just told you about, I had been speaking with a different elder, and she told me about a book that she said was one of the most helpful things that she had ever read, called The Spirituality of Imperfection. As I later began to read it, I found words and statements that were again so similar to what we had heard from thousands of residential school survivors. And I also understood all three of those elders to be zeroing in on the same truth, that on our own, we are each imperfect. And the more we tear ourselves and each other apart, the more incomplete we become. We've seen plenty of evidence of that, whether caused by racist policies and practices in society, in workplaces, as you've discussed here, or by the self-harming behaviors of individuals, which we also have to acknowledge. The more we are pulled apart, the more we need each other. We need community to fill in the missing pieces of our individual imperfections. I was thinking, isn't that the work you've been doing here for the past 2 days and throughout the 4-year history of Wicihitowin? Are we not both naming our imperfections and claiming our connections as society? And isn't that also the work we've been doing, all of us, throughout the years of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? I remember the evidence I saw of that in this very province, and here's just one example. I remember it distinctly in the community hearings we held in Prince Albert, the place where we heard the residential school story of your local hockey hero, Freddie Sisakamoose, the very first Indigenous hockey player to make it to the NHL. He, like so many other survivors, was hesitant to speak publicly, nervous, unsure that he had anything of value to share, and especially uncertain that he had the strength to share it. And I still remember my closing remarks from that day, acknowledging how the courage of the early speakers, had led to the encouragement of the later ones. Freddie was one of those needing that encouragement, and that day, we all needed Freddie's story, knowing that it too would encourage so many others. And you know, even as I was writing these words down, I still tear up at the memory of the story that he shared that day about being forced to walk the great distance back to school in his bare feet after trying to run away. And I'm still in awe about the greatness those ravaged feet went on to achieve as a hockey legend. It was that day, the day of sharing that story, that Freddie determined he would walk some 100 kilometers to attend the TRC national event held here in your city later that year. It was his way of reclaiming a missing piece of himself, a gesture and a story that would inspire many others. Encouragement to Betty Ann Adam here in the room also influenced her decision to make a film of her very first ever gathering with her 60 Scoop siblings. She had to call it Birth of a Family because she couldn't call it a family reunion. They had never before ever all been together. And to think of the encouragement that that film is now providing as it's screened throughout the land with important community dialogue and discussion about that part, the sequel in many ways to the residential school story. There are many others that I see and recognize in this room that I could name, but some of them I know your works and many others I'm sure I don't yet, and so I don't want to start identifying individuals, but instead I'll take you back to the book, which I hope will resonate with you as it has with me. The Spirituality of Imperfection. Spiritual work. Spiritual work. I recall my very first speech as a commissioner with the TRC. It was in Ottawa, and it was at a lifting up ceremony that was staged for us. And I remember going there completely unprepared for whatever would be expected of us, and being terrified as I was called upon to give a public speech to a huge auditorium full of people, not knowing that we would have to say anything. And I remember saying somewhere in whatever else I said that I understood our work to be about the restoring of strength to the broken spiritedness of individuals and of our country itself. And because it was about the restoring of spirit, it was therefore sacred work that we needed to approach in a sacred manner. The interconnectedness of all of those things, and it's what is meant when we hear people say, all my relations. It's meant when we say back home, lagotine, that we are all one, we are all family. The message of all spirituality, as I've come to know it in many different traditions throughout the world, is that in some mysterious way we are all one, and that therefore the joy and the sorrow of any one of us is the joy and sorrow of all of us. Recognizing and living that reality, this book said, is not codependence, it is love. It is love. The book also talks about one of the most frequent themes we heard throughout the thousands of survivor statements: home. I recall so many who said, I have spent my entire lifetime trying to find my way back home. I didn't fit in the white man's world, and I didn't fit in back in my community. I have spent my whole life trying to find my way home. Well, the book offers that home is ultimately that place where we find the peace and harmony that comes from learning to live with the knowledge of our own imperfections and from learning to accept the imperfections of others. Home is always there in a sense, but it needs to be discovered, somehow brought into our experience. How do we do this? How do we find home? How do we nurture home? Is this a home place that you've created in this room over the last 2 days? The tradition of a spirituality of imperfection teaches that all the tools at our command, the surest way to touch the human spirit, to find home, to find the place where we fit, is in and by and through the practice of telling and listening to stories. Imagine that, the survivors who fought for the mandate of our TRC, I'm sure they hadn't read that book, and yet they already knew that there would be a great healing in the telling and the listening to stories. And that is why the great spiritual leaders have always been storytellers, and why we retell over and over and over again the stories of those teachers, whether it's the creation stories of communities, Indigenous communities, or of the great faith tradition leaders. All stories convey how human beings like us sought and found or failed to find home, the experience of fitting into some reality. Stories that bring us both home to ourselves and into fellowship with others. Well, how do we fail to find home? How do we fail to find home? How many times did I hear this answer coming from other people's lips? It's the sense of not even knowing our own story, because we have internalized others' versions of who we are and who we should be. An inner tyrant and constant commentator who judges and scolds, reprimands and censures, we can never do or be good enough. I think of all those survivors who were raised in the schools with messages of, you're good for nothing, you'll never amount to anything, you're only good for making babies, you're a dirty little savage. Well, this book goes on to say, some try to silence that commentator and that critic, even to get rid of it through the use of alcohol or drugs, or through immersion in sexuality or food or gambling, or the amassing of material possessions. But they're always doomed efforts, for we destroy ourselves rather than destroying the critical voice. Some 90% of the survivors who bore witness to me talked about passing through drug and alcohol addictions and other related addictions as part of their healing journey, and some of them admitted they were still stuck there. Does any of it sound familiar to you? It sure does to me. And yet there is hope, and we know this. We are experiencing this hope. You've experienced it and will continue to in our ongoing work together. We disarm that inner critic, and we do that so that it can no longer take up all of that inner space. And we do it by telling and hearing of the experience, strength, and hope of others. Telling our story to someone who listens without judgment, we enter into trust, and new possibilities open up. Well, you can see that these elders and what they saw, what they recognized, and what they offered to me was a reflection of their own knowledge and their own lived experiences. Community requires more than the sharing of stories, though. True community requires the discovery of a story that is shared. And I think what is happening in Canada is the painfully slow rewriting of the story of Canada and the place of each one of us within it. And I see great hope in that story, not because of anything, not because of everything, but in spite of everything. In spite of everything. There are extraordinary examples of leadership in your province. You know them better than I, and you've talked about many of them in the past 2 days. I heard reference to some of them in terrific leadership from the corporate sector that I heard about this morning, and about the University of Saskatchewan earlier today. But also, you may or may not know, the University of Victoria just last week officially launched the first ever in Canada Indigenous law program that will run parallel to a common law program in that law school. Major national associations like the Heart and Stroke Foundation have built within their structures a circle of Indigenous champions to advise them on the application of their programs. The North American Medical Association, well beyond our borders, has asked for opportunity to hear about and learn about the correlation between residential school experiences and the ongoing traumas in the medical health crises that is not just in our country, but rampant in Indigenous communities throughout North America and indeed around the world. University of Toronto, you may or may not know, has launched the first ever in the world Masters of Social Work program in Indigenous trauma. The representative cohort there is from all 4 directions by design, so that the 4 directions can have opportunity to work creatively together. And they're grounded in the values of the Sweetgrass teachings of kindness and acceptance, inclusion and cooperation, and their courses and their coursework is graded from that perspective as well as the content. And each and every individual in the program has the obligation and the opportunity for an anchored personal wellness plan to see them through that difficult and challenging work. In Edmonton, there are public art parks, and I understand you've just recently, in recent months, opened one here as well, to make that challenge in so many urban communities of Indigenous people being invisible or ignored, suddenly visible and not always in a negative light. There's a book to be launched next week, which is a beautiful story about the political and constitutional development of Northern Canada, which most Canadians know nothing about, where we have Indigenous majorities running the governments, and where heroes in our midst, unsung, are captured in beautiful stories that give full credit to their contributions to Canada, and written with great care and journalistic knowledge by someone who's come to know them and to love them. We saw the young professionals that are being prepared in our midst just before I spoke here today. There are Indigenous internship programs in major corporations that I'm aware of and public institutions. It's all just teeny. It's all inching forward. It's mini steps. And the field of philanthropy I already touched on. We could go on and on. I can tell you that you cannot teach now in the Northwest Territories or the Yukon or Nunavut without, before you ever set foot in your classroom, having an intensive course of study on residential schools and colonialism. And that's before you have to do the mandatory curriculum that is now there for everyone. 2 public film festivals, Vancouver and Toronto, People's Choice Awards to Indigenous films and Indigenous filmmaking. Today, the National Moose Hide Campaign, and many people across the country fasting in support of that important campaign to bring attention to violence against women and children. Internationally, and to give you headlines only, there is engaging work being done among the Sami in Norway and in Finland. I just returned from working with Reconciliation Australia. Next week, I'll be starting some work with the Roma people in Europe. And New Zealand has asked as well to speak because they have heard about Canada. They have heard about you. They have heard about the work that you have stirred up and the efforts that you are making, and they want to know, how can we do more of what you're doing in Canada? And I say all of these things not to pretend, as I said before, that things are better than they are, but for us to not lose sight of those things that slowly but surely are hopeful signs and where good things are being done by good people who are coming to know each other and respect each other in new ways. Well, I want to leave you with some images. I want to show you some pictures. And really, they stand out for me as I reflect upon our work. Not everything I have to think about it, but some key points. And the first is that you are not alone. Someone talked about that this morning. And we are not alone. And that image, disturbing as it is, I took that picture last week, and it is in a major public place in downtown Sydney, Australia. And it's an image of their history. And when I shared it with Australian colleagues, not one of them was even aware of its presence. To what extent do we always run the risk of becoming blind to what is in our midst and neutralized to those things that should be outrageous? We are not alone, and we made it a point, and I think it's a lesson worth reminding and repeating always, to keep, in our case, the victims of harm and the heroes of the story, the survivors, at the heart of our work. And that was our Survivors Advisory Committee. You see your beloved Big Bird there at the back. And one of our members there sadly departed since this photo was taken. But we are not alone. The second thing I want to say, this is where can you chew gum and pat your head at the same time? That we do better as individuals, as families, and as a country when we come together. Sharing and witnessing stories encourages and inspires others, builds trust, and it expands community. It redefines and reshapes community. This was one of the entry parades at one of our national events. And this is a group of our honorary witnesses. There were over 75 of them, very prominent citizens from all sectors of society. And you see there our beloved Sheila, who was on stage with me earlier this morning, and Commissioners Littlechild and Sinclair surrounding her. You probably know most of the others, but one of our former prime ministers, our former Auditor General, the chair of our National Human Rights Commission in previous years, a former Minister of Indian Affairs who, like so many others, said, I was in charge of the department, and still I did not understand the enormity of what had happened until I heard from survivors as experts in this story. And on the far left, and he was here in Saskatoon, so perhaps some of you met him, a child survivor from the Holocaust who said, when residential school survivors speak their truth, I hear my childhood. He understood and he could relate to the devastations that have got us to, well, to the point of a TRC. Hopefully not to where we are today. Hopefully we are moving. The third thing I want to share is that culture and ceremony are healing. They are not feathers and smoke, and we must not minimize these things as being tokenistic or the checklist must-do things. They have their own deep value, and we saw and heard that many times over. They're healing not only in terms of relationship, but also in terms of children's understanding of the families to which they belong and the identities which they are trying to be part of. They provide value-based teachings, and they nurture these great feelings of inclusion and belonging. This particular ceremony, an ancient one, was a traditional welcome by the Coast Salish people in British Columbia, where we had to, by the gesture of our canoe paddles, make plain that we were not intending any aggression, that we were there for peaceful purposes, and we had to announce that, shout it from the water, why we were there before we were allowed officially to come ashore. And this one you may recognize a number of your own leaders right here, where we had huge grand entries into the grounds here, partly because of the ceremony and respect we wanted to bring to it, and partly because we wanted to make sure that no one could avoid our presence in your lands here and the important work that all were invited to be part of. The fourth thing I want to say is that children belong at the center of our circles. I know that intuitively as a mother and grandmother, but I heard so many people come to our TRC and talk about that as ancient wisdom. And all our efforts should be aimed at putting them back in their rightful place, in the center of the circle, and not having them torn apart or taken away. Why the center? Because it's a place of nurturing and protection and care. So this was our intention in the birthday parties that we held at the end of each and every one of our national events, where the children were invited to sing happy birthday and where we had elders help them sing happy birthday in all of the languages that we could muster in honor of the survivor children who never in their years at residential schools ever had their birthdays celebrated. And it was always a moment of great emotion, great longing, and great hope. So children belong at the center of all our circles. This image of hope is Sadea, little sunshine, her name means, and she's my granddaughter. And she's standing proudly holding her traditional bone tool in front of a moose hide. And that was taken about 3 weeks ago in downtown Yellowknife, right on the front steps of the City Hall, just off to the side, where for the third year in a row, a group of young people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, have mounted a traditional moose hide tanning camp as a way of teaching themselves and being taught by the elders they brought in, as a way of teaching their children, and as a way of reaching out to wider community, both their pride in their culture and an appreciation for the extraordinarily hard work and determination and effort it takes to make things of such lasting beauty and purpose. Well, I was sharing with that group of elders that I told you about the message that we left for all of Canada when we wrapped up the TRC, and which you heard Senator Sinclair talk about this morning. And it was that message that the work of our commission may well be over officially, but the work of reconciliation is still just beginning, and that it was bound to be much longer and even harder. And without a pause, one of those elders said, "If it takes 5 minutes to walk into the forest, how long does it take to walk out?" And I understood the point they were making, that reconciliation is like that. It took us 150 years to walk into this place in our history. And unless we can find some shortcuts or some easier pathways or some people, willing walkers and carriers, to be by our sides, walking out is going to be a long journey. Do we have the courage for that? Do we have the humility for that? And do we have, and thank you, Neil, for your good comments, do we have faith enough in our young people to believe they will carry on this work when our days are done, for as long as it may take? From the very first volume of Healing Voices, a primer on Native boarding schools in the United States, a document I was given just a few days ago when I had meetings with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And by the way, that's a group that was in its infancy during our TRC. They came here to your town to witness and learn from what we were doing. And they've since gone on, formed an organization in advocacy, and they're trying to do everything on all fronts. Anyway, they shared with me a beautiful publication, and one of the quotes there jumped off the page for me. It said, "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." So just as I wrap up, to say that reminds me, and possibly all of you, but it reminds me of my grandchildren and how beautiful and strong and vibrant they each are becoming. And as I told you, I've been on the road for a few weeks now. And on one of my calls home, my youngest grandson couldn't wait to tell me something. "Guess what, Mimi?" he said. "I can wiggle my ears." And I wasn't sure if I had heard him correctly. "You can do what?" I said. "I can wiggle my ears." "Did you look at yourself in the mirror?" I asked him. "Yep, I did." And then I said, "What the? Am I alfalfa?" So I lifted my hair up so I could see better, and I looked closer, and I wiggled my ears again, and I said, "Yep, I guess I'm alfalfa." So if you haven't seen the remake of The Little Rascals, that's what we're talking about there. So there he was, and that's why I want to share this story. This little 7-year-old doing something that even he couldn't imagine he was capable of. And that brings me to my last slide. Because here you are, doing something that seemed unimaginable not so many years ago, when you and others like you and so many other parts of Canada, when all of us first set out on this journey of truth, healing, reconciliation, and reconciliation. I know you have honored the sacred number 4 with your Wicihitowin gatherings to date. I wish you unimaginable vision as you determine the next steps together on this unfolding journey for the sake of all our children. Miigwech, hai hai, masicho. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.